other words, I didn't want to be worried about that. And if somebody was going to shoot me, they were going to shoot me. There wasn't much I could do about it. So I guess we could say I put my life in the hands of the Lord. And,
You also like to tell us your thoughts.
Well, really, my greatest success is you're looking at her. See, I was married first time to a lady named Sarah Knox Taylor, whose father was Zachary Taylor. And when I went through West Point, I had a certain attitude about how life could be so much fun and so forth, and almost got kicked out of West Point. When Sarah Knox Taylor died, my sister said, don't even come to this area because there's malaria. But you know what happens when you're young? Sometimes you're stupid because you think you know, and I went anyway, and one of us died, and that was her after 3 months of marriage. When I met Marina, I got spring to my step again. And we had a life together that we still have, a loving relationship, and behind closed doors, not open in public, she will tell me her opinion. And after the war, she said to me, which I didn't really like hearing it, the right side won. Now my biggest failure is replacing Joe Johnston, who had the slows, with John Bell Hood, who really almost decimated the Western Confederate Army. And not getting rid of Braxton Bragg at certain points. You know, the thing about Braxton Bragg is people always say, why did you leave him in command? Because he was a great strategist. He knew how to integrate the infantry, artillery, engineers, and the cavalry together. But his big thing is he wasn't liked by his men. They didn't like him. In fact, General Nathan Bedford Forrest said, I will not ever serve under you, Braxton Bragg. There could have been a duel right there, and I know that Bragg wouldn't have lived. So there you have it. And you know, I was going to give a rebuttal on Lincoln talking about lack of education. But see, the thing about education is this. We all can be educated, you can all be sitting in the same room, but how much do you absorb in your head? And use the information given is your education. Not saying you went to West Point, not saying you did this, Transylvania University, and so forth. That's your education, and that was Mr. Lincoln, that was the top.
thank you, sir.
The way it was given. So
And, well, I never did make contact with the Indians, but I fought many bloody battles with the mosquitoes. Well, Black Hawk was taken by other soldiers than ourselves. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
I don't need my rebuttal.
Okay. And we'll address you again, President Lincoln, first. If you would be so kind as to tell us, what do you feel was your greatest success as well as your greatest mistake?
Well, I suppose being elected president would be my greatest success, and again, whoever could imagine that? Somebody with hardly any education, and also this surely was the will of the good Lord. I don't know what else we could say, but regarding that, looking back now, I have to say, I hate to say this, but probably my biggest mistake was holding on to General George McClellan as long as I did. Well, Mr. McClellan, well, I think we could say he was a wonderful engineer. I worked with him before the war with the railroad there, going through Illinois and so forth. Of course, I was working as an attorney there, and he was as an engineer, and I got to know him somewhat then. And well, when Mr. Scott resigned, he was Scott was my first general-in-chief, and when he resigned, he was a huge fellow and in such bad shape he could hardly even get himself up off of the chair. And, by the way, he was a huge fellow, much bigger than I am. And he was the general that led the army into Mexico and did a wonderful job with that as far as that's concerned. But he did resign, when was it? In November, I believe. The war started there in April. When Mr. Scott resigned, I assigned General George McClellan to take his place, and I had such high hopes in him. well, perhaps you're all familiar with that, with him, and well, what's a good way to say it? He had great ideas. Well, one of the things he did was he moved the army of what, 100,000 clear down by water, clear down to the southern end of the Virginia Peninsula, which the Confederates were not expected, and he managed to do that. But what did he do once he got his army there? He just sat there, and he did make his way up the state and so forth, and well, I told somebody General McClellan was a wonderful engineer, but it seemed like his specialty was a stationary engine.
Oh, finally.
Yeah, we're moving quite along here. And you may take this question first, Mr. Davis. If you had a choice, knowing that you never met in real life, but if you did have that choice to meet one another in real life, what would be the one thing that you would like to say to that person?
Well, let's put it this way. It depends on whether it's 1861, 1862, 1863, 1864, or 1865. Because, see, on March 4th of 1865, well, what that date, the newspapers wrote his second inaugural. And he said, with malice towards none. Now, see, the Republican Party hated their name so much that in 1864 they almost dropped the name and became the Union, National Union Party. And what they did was make the biggest mistake they ever made by placing Andrew Johnson on the ticket. Now, in 1845, when I was elected to the House of Representatives, I gave a speech that I said, the military should be making a decision about the Mexican War, not a blacksmith or a tailor. You know what Andrew Johnson was by trade? He was a tailor. He took that, but I was talking about him. He didn't like me. 20 years later, I'm in prison in Fort Monroe with accused of implicating me in the assassination of a certain person. I didn't pay it, but 3 abolitionists paid that $100,000 along with 10 individuals who paid $2,500 to get me released from prison. So I'd say to him, because I know what he said, I heard through the grapevine, we had some spies, that if I got away, he'd be happy. He didn't want to deal with me, because I could have been him, he could have been me.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. President Lincoln, do you have some words on what you would have liked to say to President Davis?
Oh boy.
Because we'll address you next with this question. Your experience in the military, please tell us what is your education both in and out of the military?
When I was 2 years old, my father and mother left Kentucky and moved to Louisiana shortly, and rice planting wasn't up to my father's plan, so we moved to Mississippi. Do I remember that? No, I was only 2. So by the age of 8, Mississippi wasn't even a state yet. It was a territory, and my father, believing education was very important, set me up in St. Thomas Aquinas as a Catholic school near Springfield, Kentucky. And other than that, I went to Jefferson College, Wilkinson Academy. I do remember coming home one time and telling my father that the teacher was trying to teach me something I didn't think I needed to know. And I knew more than the teacher, so he said, yeah, you go out and pick cotton and see how long it takes you to change your mind. It only took 2 days of bending over, picking, bending over, picking. Then I went to another college in Kentucky for 3 years, and then my older brother, who was almost like a father to me, because my father was 62 when I was born. My mother was 49, ma'am, when I was born, and now I was the 10th child. Yeah, I know, I get those looks all the time from women who's had children. 49! And my older brother, Joseph, secured me an appointment to West Point. So I went to West Point for 4 years. And then I served in the military after graduation from West Point, where I was placed into infantry, because when you go to West Point, it's either the engineers, top of your class, cavalry, artillery, of course infantry at the bottom. Artillery is really second as far as points and stuff, and you get the merits. Then I served 7 years out west. Then I resigned when I met my first wife, Sarah Knox Taylor, who was the daughter of Zachary Taylor, and that's my education, and that's my military career. Mr. Lincoln, I'll sit down and wait for your 20-second response.
20-second reply.
Yeah.
By the way, it's very obvious which of us has the gift of gab. In fact, I do not care to deliver extemporaneous speeches. I much rather sit and think and come up with, well, I don't want to say anything foolish with my speeches. And by the way, Mr. Davis's here last response now, I do recall somebody asking me clear that we knew the war was coming to an end, what they should do with Jefferson Davis. And my response, I hope he can get away, just let him go.
I appreciate that, Mr. Lincoln.
Well, as far as my education, well, virtually none. I am so blessed as a 5-year-old down there in Kentucky. My folks were very poor, well, very typical of most folks around in that area as far as that's concerned. And my mom and pa could not read. And as a 5-year-old, one of the blessings of my life, they did send me off to a school, just one of the neighboring log cabins, I suppose a couple miles away. The main reason I suppose they sent me off was to keep my sister Sarah company. Sarah was 2 years older than I, and I don't think they expected me to learn. But as a 5-year-old, I soon caught on to reading. And I recall very well, even though my folks couldn't read, we had a Bible in our home, and I would take out the Bible and practice sounding out the words in that wonderful book. By the way, I have to say I've kept the Bible, especially here as president, kept the Bible handy all the time. And I could not have gotten through this time without that wonderful book. So, well, as time went by, we moved to Indiana when I was 7 years of age, and especially after I was big enough to help on the farm, my pa would keep me home, would not allow me to go to school. I probably all the days altogether, no more than 100 days total in my life. Never went to college. And somehow I managed to become an attorney. When I went on my own, I tended a store and all kinds of odd jobs there. In New Salem, became an attorney, and actually I was elected as a state representative before I became an attorney, and somehow became president of these United States. And how that ever happened, I cannot imagine.
Mr. Lincoln, I think you forgot your military. I need a rebuttal.
Oh, okay, that was part of the question.
Okay, well, go ahead, Mr. Lincoln, finish your military.
Well, that was the next question?
No, that was part of that question, your military.
Well, my military, well, let me think now. I moved to New Salem when I was 22 and tended a store, got to know the fellows there, and let's say I must not have been much of a storekeeper. That store winked out or went bankrupt, if you don't understand that. And the Indian chief of Black Hawk had come back into Illinois to take the property which was rightfully theirs. And I have to say, I'm embarrassed the history here of our country, the treatment of we call them Indians. I've been told that's not proper. I think you know who I'm referring to. But the treatment of the Indians, and you probably know the treaties that were signed. You know who broke the treaties? Most cases was the white man. How, in my studies, how some of those folks could sleep at night, I cannot imagine. And those poor folks, well, anyhow, I guess I was 23, and the governor called up a militia, and the store was closed. I had no means of income, so I joined up in the militia, and just right there in the little, in the New Salem area. We formed our own company, and in those days the company would elect their officers, and I was amazed those fellows elected me to be their captain. And And I consider that one of the proudest times of my whole life. I had no idea that those fellows thought that much of me. So, well, make just a short story.